I still remember the strong smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic sound of heart monitors, and that tense silence that only exists in hospitals during the night. My name is Dr. Rafael Moreira. I've been an intensive care physician for more than 15 years, and if there's one thing I've learned in that time, it's that the line separating life from death is much thinner than most people imagine. I've worked in emergency rooms, ICUs, and trauma wards of several hospitals, places where science shows all its strength and sometimes its impotence. I don't consider myself a religious man. I've always been driven by reason, by protocols, tests, and numbers. But there are nights and patients that change everything you believe in. And that's exactly what happened on that early morning of July 17th, a night that began like so many others, with bitter coffee, empty hallways, and the hope that no alarm would break the silence. In medicine, we learn to protect ourselves emotionally. We learn not to get too attached, to see the body as a system and the patient as a case. But there are days when the case has a name, a story, and the look of someone who doesn't want to leave. And that's how I met Eduardo, 42 years old, a truck driver, father of 2 children. He arrived at the emergency room unconscious, brought in by paramedics after a highway accident. The initial report mentioned severe chest trauma and cardiac arrest during transport. Statistically, his chances of survival were minimal, but medicine, no matter how advanced, can't predict everything. I remember when the paramedics pushed the stretcher through the door. The sound of the defibrillator echoed through the hallways, and the white lights reflected off the sweat on the nurses' faces. In that instant, I knew that every second would be crucial. And I also knew, for some reason I still can't explain, that this story wouldn't be like the others. Sometimes, a doctor can sense when something extraordinary is about to happen. It's like a silent intuition, something not found in books or clinical guidelines. And that night, before I even touched the patient, I felt that something greater was already in motion. Eduardo was pale, pulseless, with multiple fractured ribs. But what caught my attention was his wife's gaze. Anna stood at the emergency room door. She didn't say a word. She just held a rosary tightly in her right hand. Even when we asked her to step back, she remained there as if she knew that something within her could help the man she loved. There are cases where science does all it can, and the rest depends on the unexplainable. At that moment, I didn't yet know that I was about to witness one of the most challenging and moving episodes of my entire career, because sometimes life can't be measured only by heartbeats. And it was that night, amidst alarms, chest compressions, and silent prayers, that I discovered how much the human heart can endure, even when every monitor says it has stopped. Eduardo's heart stopped for exactly 6 minutes and 43 seconds, and it was within that interval, between death and life, that something impossible happened. But before I tell you what I witnessed that morning, I need to ask you something important. I need at least 100 comments so that YouTube will deliver this video to more people. So, if you believe there are things that go beyond scientific explanation, write in the comments, "I believe in miracles." Now then, listen carefully, because what happened that night isn't just a medical story. It's a reminder that life sometimes ignores every statistic. It was just after 2 in the morning when the sound of an alarm broke the silence of the ICU. It wasn't a normal sound. It was the kind of alarm every doctor recognizes immediately, the one that announces that death is knocking at the door. The team reacted with near-automatic precision. The doors flew open, the lights brightened, and the once quiet hallway filled with hurried footsteps and coordinated voices. "No pulse! Starting compressions!" shouted Patricia, the most experienced nurse on duty. "Adrenaline 1 milligram! Administered!" I took over the resuscitation. Eduardo's body moved rhythmically under my hands. Compression, ventilation, rhythm check, more compression. Time distorted. 5 minutes felt like 50. Outside, behind the glass window, was Anna, his wife, on her knees. Her hands trembled but remained steady, as she held a small white rosary. She didn't scream or cry. She just looked on. There was something in that gaze I had never seen before in all my years of medicine. She seemed to be somewhere else, in another time, as if she was speaking with something invisible, something that we inside that room couldn't understand. "Doctor, it's been over 6 minutes," one of the residents said. I knew what that meant. The protocol indicated we should stop the maneuvers, but something inside me wouldn't let me give up. It was irrational, almost instinctive, but strong enough to make me continue. "One more cycle," I ordered. The room fell into absolute silence, except for the sound of compressions and air entering the endotracheal tube. And then something happened. It was subtle at first. The monitor, previously flat, began to show a faint oscillation, an irregular, almost imperceptible line. "Check for pulse," I said. Silence. Then a shout. "There's a pulse! He's got a pulse!" For a second, no one moved. It was as if time itself had stopped to confirm what our eyes were seeing. The monitor's beep returned, first hesitant, then steady, rhythmic. Eduardo's heart was beating again. The room erupted in relief. Some embraced, others wiped away discreet tears behind their masks. But outside, Anna remained on her knees. And what struck me the most was that she smiled before we even knew he was back, as if she had felt it. In the following hours, Eduardo remained unconscious, connected to machines and closely monitored. But what he said when he finally opened his eyes completely changed the way I understood life, death, and everything that lies in between. But that is not the time to tell yet. First, you need to know who this man was and what brought him there. Because to understand what happened in that room, you must first understand what was inside that heart before it stopped beating. Eduardo arrived at the emergency room around 1:40 a.m. The ambulance driver came in breathless, shouting for help before the vehicle had even stopped completely. He had suffered a serious accident on the highway. The truck he was driving had overturned after a sudden brake on a dark, wet stretch of road. When paramedics found him, he was unconscious, with extensive injuries and clear signs of severe chest trauma. The report was straightforward. Multiple rib fractures, suspected hemothorax, oxygen saturation below 70%. And the most worrying detail, he had gone into cardiac arrest inside the ambulance. He had been briefly resuscitated, but went into collapse again just minutes before reaching the hospital. Time is the greatest enemy in cases like this. Every second of delay costs neurons, organs, memories, possibilities. When the body arrives, sometimes the soul is already halfway gone. Even so, we try. We always try. While the nurses prepared the equipment, I looked at his face for the first time. There were grease stains on his hands, his face partially covered in dried blood, and a small amulet hanging from his neck, a worn scapula, dusty and soaked in sweat. Those little things say a lot about a patient, more than any medical record could. There he was, a simple man, a worker, someone who probably spent more time on the road than at home. A few minutes later, his wife arrived, Anna, around 39 years old, thin, hair tied in a hurried bun, eyes red from crying. When security tried to stop her from entering the restricted area, she only whispered, "Please, he promised me he'd come home today." That sentence stuck in my mind. Anna held a plastic bag with his phone and a sandwich wrapped in foil, probably something she had prepared herself. There was so much love in that simple gesture that, for a moment, I felt a sting of helplessness. It's strange, but sometimes what weighs the most in a hospital isn't the sound of alarms, it's the silence of those waiting outside, unsure if there will still be a later. As we began the procedures, something caught my attention. Eduardo's wristwatch. It had stopped at 1:27 a.m., exactly the time, according to the paramedics, when he had his first cardiac arrest. Coincidence, maybe, but that night, every detail seemed to carry hidden meaning. The next minutes were intense. We inserted the endotracheal tube, drained the chest, stabilized blood pressure with norepinephrine. Every movement was quick and precise, yet the situation remained critical. Still, something bothered me. Throughout the process, his heart rate, though unstable, showed a curious pattern. The tracings fluctuated in uneven peaks, almost as if the heart insisted on fighting, even without enough strength. And as I watched the monitor, I wondered how many times life itself had done the same to us. Insisted when everything said it was over. Later, during imaging exams, we found out the accident had been caused by a sudden landslide on the road. Eduardo swerved to avoid hitting another car and ended up falling into a deep ditch. According to the firefighters, he had been trapped in the wreckage for nearly 20 minutes before being rescued. His body was covered in mud, his chest compressed, his breathing barely existent, and yet he held on. When I asked his wife if he had any previous conditions, she replied, "He always said his heart was strong, that nothing could bring him down." She said it with a half smile, as if clinging to the faintest trace of hope. But what intrigued me most came next, when she added in a low voice, almost a whisper, "He dreamed 2 days ago that he had an accident and that he woke up in a place full of light. He said it was beautiful, that he felt no pain, and that someone told him, 'It's not your time yet.'" At that moment, I just stayed silent. Science had taught me that dreams are a product of the unconscious, but that night I began to wonder if the unconscious wasn't, perhaps, the closest border to the unknown. Eduardo was fighting between life and death, and we were about to discover that this fight wasn't just physiological, it was something much deeper, something that crossed the body and touched the unexplainable. Shortly after 3 in the morning, the emergency room looked like an extension of life itself, chaotic, unpredictable, and fragile. Eduardo was intubated, connected to monitors and infusion pumps, with every wire and every tube representing one more attempt to keep him on the right side of existence. The team moved with the precision of a broken clock, fast, yet weighed down by the impossible. The numbers on the monitor rose and fell like waves in a storm. His blood pressure dropped, heart rhythm alternated between tachycardia and bradycardia, and his oxygen saturation stubbornly refused to rise. In moments like that, clinical instinct speaks louder than any protocol. We readjusted the ventilator, corrected blood gases, changed medications, but nothing seemed to stabilize. His body, already exhausted, reacted as if fighting with its last thread of energy. Each heartbeat was a silent resistance against collapse. And on the other side of the glass, Anna watched, motionless, her hands still holding the rosary. There was no despair in her gaze. There was surrender, a faith that didn't beg, only trusted. The clock on the wall showed 3:17 a.m. when the monitor beeped again. The cardiac tracing began to deform, peaks turning erratic, the line oscillating between life and silence. "He's fibrillating!" shouted Patricia. "Charge the defibrillator, 200 joules!" Eduardo's body, convulsed with the impact of the electric shock. Silence. Nothing. Again, 300. Another shock. The monitor responded with a brief electrical signal, and then a flat line. Everyone's eyelids seemed to drop at the same time. No pulse. Time of arrest? 3 minutes. Continue compressions. At that moment, the air in the room grew heavier. The sound of the equipment, the hiss of the respirator, the intermittent beep of the oximeter, all merged with a strange sensation, almost spiritual. It was as if the space between sound and silence carried something invisible, something reason couldn't touch. I continued the compressions. The muscles in my arms ached, sweat ran down my face, and I asked myself, once again, if it still made sense to go on. But when I looked at his face, I saw something that made me persist, a serene expression, almost peaceful, unlike any cardiac arrest patient I had ever seen. It was as if, in the middle of chaos, he had found calm. "More adrenaline," I ordered. The IV drug was injected. Nothing. The clock read 5 minutes into the arrest. Clinically, we were crossing the safety threshold. The team had begun preparing to end the protocol, and that's when Anna, outside the glass wall, slammed her hand against it. Everyone turned. She was crying, but not out of despair. There was something different in her tears, a mixture of faith and plea. She pressed her palm against the glass and murmured something that, even without hearing, everyone seemed to understand. Then she lifted the rosary and pressed it to her chest. At that instant, the heart monitor beeped again, a small oscillation, barely perceptible. "Wait! There's a rhythm!" said one of the resident doctors. We rushed to check for a pulse. Nothing. The line flattened again. Silence filled the room. One more shock. 360. Another jolt. His body arched. The monitor remained silent. And then something strange happened. The lights in the room flickered for a split second. A sharp crack echoed against the wall. The monitor went dark, then came back to life, showing an irregular, trembling line. "Sinus rhythm. Slow, but present," announced Patricia, her voice breaking. Everyone looked at each other. It was improbable, unexplainable. Eduardo had a pulse again, but with the return of his heartbeat, something else filled the room, an indescribable presence, as if all of us were being watched by something beyond the walls, beyond ourselves. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time in years of intensive care, I felt fear. Not fear of death, but of the unknown that seemed to manifest there, silently, between the machines and the body that refused to die. As we stabilized the patient, I noticed his body temperature had dropped drastically, as though he were in a state of hypothermia despite continuous warming. But the detail that struck me most came minutes later, when his cardiac rhythm stabilized. His wristwatch, the one that had stopped at 127, started ticking again. No one had touched it. There was no explanation. At that moment, I looked toward Anna. She met my gaze with eyes that said, "I knew it," and I had no words. I just stood there, trying to understand what was in front of me. A miracle, perhaps, or something science has yet to name. The hours that followed were a mix of exhaustion and silence. In medicine, after an extreme event like that, the adrenaline takes a long time to fade from the body. The mind tries to rationalize what happened, but the heart knows. There's something there that logic cannot explain. Eduardo was alive, but his body seemed reluctant to return fully. His pulse was weak, irregular, and his breathing depended entirely on the ventilator. Even so, something about him felt different. While the nurses monitored his vital signs, I noticed something curious. His pupils weren't responding as expected. Instead of remaining dilated, they slowly contracted, as if reacting to an invisible light. And for a few brief seconds, I had the distinct feeling that he knew we were there. A flicker of consciousness, maybe, or something beyond that. Patricia, standing beside me, whispered, "Doctor, the atmosphere, it feels different, doesn't it?" I didn't answer, but she was right. The air felt heavy and calm at the same time. The machines hummed like steady whispers, and even the footsteps in the hallway seemed slower. That kind of atmosphere that comes right before something, but you don't know what. At 3:58 a.m., the monitor beeped. Again, a brief spike, then a series of oscillations. His heart rate rose to 90, then 110. His oxygen levels began to improve. "He's responding!" one of the residents cried. But the joy didn't last long. His body began to move. First, a faint tremor in his hands, then an involuntary muscle contraction, and suddenly his eyes opened. It was one of those moments when time seems to freeze. Everyone's heart in the room stopped for a second. Eduardo stared directly at the ceiling, not like someone waking from sleep, but like someone seeing something. His eyes moved slowly, following something we couldn't see. "Eduardo, can you hear me?" I asked, trying to keep calm. Nothing. His gaze remained fixed, too still, too serene for a man who had just been brought back from death. For a few seconds, I felt both fascination and discomfort. There was something profoundly human, and at the same time, eerily otherworldly in that expression. He seemed caught between two places, present, but not fully. Alive, yet distant. Check for motor response, I instructed. The resident touched his shoulder, and at that moment he whispered something, weak, almost inaudible. A hoarse, rasping sound that barely formed a word, but we all heard it. Light! The entire room froze. The nurse dropped the thermometer. Anna's eyes, from behind the glass, filled with tears. She pressed her hands against her chest and began to whisper something, probably a prayer. Eduardo, what did you say? I asked again. A time. He slowly turned his head toward me, and then something in his eyes hit me like a punch. It wasn't fear nor confusion. It was peace. A deep, absolute, almost supernatural peace. He's waking up, the resident said, excited. But I knew it wasn't just that. That expression wasn't from someone simply coming out of a coma. It was from someone who had brought something back with him, something he saw, experienced, felt, and now carried in his eyes. In the next few minutes, he stabilized. Completely. His heart returned to a normal rhythm, oxygen levels held steady, and his blood pressure normalized without the need for vasopressors. It was improbable. No medical explanation justified such a quick recovery. And yet, it happened right before our eyes. As the monitors displayed perfect numbers, all I could think about was the impossible. Not just that he had survived, but how. And, more importantly, why. Because sometimes it isn't the body that decides to return, it's something within, a silent will that transcends biology, whispering, it's not over yet. That night, something extraordinary happened. But what Eduardo later revealed, when he could finally speak clearly, was what truly shattered everything I thought I knew about life and death. And that's when this story stopped being just a clinical case and became a mystery that still follows me to this day. There are nights in a doctor's life that leave marks impossible to erase. That night was one of them. I had seen bodies breathe again, hearts regain rhythm, eyes open after long minutes of silence. But I had never felt anything like that. It wasn't just a physiological return, it was as if the entire room had been touched by something immeasurable, unrecordable, unexplainable. When the situation finally stabilized, I sat for a moment beside Eduardo. He was sedated, but calm. The line on the monitor showed an almost poetic steadiness. Regular heartbeats, mechanical breathing, balanced pressure. The team, exhausted, began to disperse. Silence reclaimed the ICU, and all that remained was the rhythmic sound of machines, a reminder that life goes on, even when it seems impossible. For years, I believed medicine was an absolute science, that for every cause there's an effect, for every failure an explanation, but there are moments that defy that logic. Moments when the impossible happens right before the eyes of the most skeptical observer, and all you can do is accept it. Not as weakness, but as humility before the unknown. That night I realized how medicine, as powerful as it is only a bridge. We treat the body, but there is something else, a kind of force perhaps, that decides whether it returns or not. Call it faith, energy, soul, God. Everyone will give it their own name, but it exists. And when it manifests, you can feel it. I remember watching Anna through the glass. She didn't sleep, not even for a second. Throughout the night, she kept the same expression, steady, confident, as if she already knew the result before any test could confirm it. And that's when I understood something I had never admitted before. Love can be a form of healing, not the romantic, idealized kind, but that deep, unconditional love that creates a bond between two souls, making one fight for the other, even at the edge of the impossible. Maybe that's why the human heart sometimes insists on beating when everything seems lost, because there's something beyond muscle, beyond blood and biochemistry. There's the memory of who we love, the unfulfilled promise, the voice that still echoes in the mind, saying, "Come back to me." And maybe that's the voice science can't record in any test, but life can recognize and obey. In the days that followed, I thought about that case countless times. I reviewed the charts, compared the exams, searched for plausible physiological explanations. None of them made sense. There was no clinical reason for him to have survived, and even less for him to have woken up with no neurological damage. It was as if death had merely brushed his skin and then, for some reason, stepped back. Some colleagues called it luck. Others said it was persistence, skill, experience. But I knew there was something more. Because I was there, I felt it. And no book, no theory, no protocol can translate what you feel when life decides to return without warning. Over time, I began to wonder, have we all, at some point, been saved by something invisible? How many times have we escaped something and called it coincidence, when maybe it was intervention? And how many lives are touched every day by forces that don't fit into the definition of miracle, but are still miracles all the same? Since that night, I've never entered an emergency room the same way again. I began to see each patient not as a collection of organs, but as an entire universe of stories, emotions, connections, and mysteries. And every time the monitor shows a flat line, I ask myself if, on the other side, there's someone fighting to bring it back, because maybe death isn't an end, but a temporary limit, and life, stubborn as it is, always finds a way to return. It took 2 days for Eduardo to wake up completely. During that time, he remained on mechanical ventilation, oscillating between light sedation and partial awareness. His body was responding well, the tests were improving, and little by little we reduced the medications. But there was something curious. Even while unconscious, he seemed to respond to certain stimuli in unusual ways. When Anna approached, for example, his heart rate would rise slightly. When she spoke to him, his brain waves, previously slow and scattered, became more organized. It was as if, somehow, his body recognized the presence of the one who loved him. On the morning of the 3rd day, he opened his eyes slightly. The light from the window passed through the curtain and illuminated his face. Anna was by his side, holding his hand, and when she saw that small movement, she began to cry quietly, a restrained cry, almost of relief. I called the team, and little by little he regained consciousness. His eyes, still heavy, took time to focus on something. But when they finally did, they looked straight at me. "You were there?" he asked, his voice hoarse. It took me a few seconds to answer. "Yes, Eduardo, I was with you." He took a deep breath. I thought you were the other one." "The other one?" He didn't answer. He just looked away and murmured, "There was so much light." At that moment, I thought it could be a side effect of the sedation. Delirium is common in patients who go through extreme situations. But as the days passed, he began to remember fragments. And what he said didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like a memory. During one of his visits, while I was checking his exams, he said calmly, "I heard you. I heard when you said I wouldn't come back." I stayed silent. He continued, "But not the way you... Here. It was like I was above. I saw everything. You, the machines, the stopped clock. I saw Anna outside on her knees." Anna's hands trembled. "Eduardo, are you sure about what you're saying?" I asked, trying to keep a professional tone, though my voice betrayed my astonishment. He nodded firmly. "I wasn't asleep, doctor. I just wasn't here anymore." I wrote everything down, as I always do in unusual cases. But inside, a voice questioned how much of this was a product of the brain, and how much went beyond human understanding. Eduardo described details he could never have seen from where he lay. He mentioned the necklace a nurse was wearing, a spilled cup in the corner of the room, even the exact words a resident spoke when she thought he wouldn't make it. None of that was in the medical records, but every detail was true. When I asked him what he remembered before coming back, he paused for a long time, as if searching for words to describe the indescribable. It was silence, but not emptiness. Peace. I felt no pain, no fear, only light and a presence, as if someone was waiting for me. "Someone?" I asked. "Yes, but it wasn't like seeing a person. It was like recognizing something that had always been with me, even without me noticing. His gaze was distant, yet serene. Anna held his hand tightly, and for the first time since the accident, she smiled. And in that moment, I realized there was no room left for skepticism, only for listening. In the following days, Eduardo recovered quickly. His progress defied every medical prediction. There were no signs of brain damage, no motor deficits, nothing. It was as if his body had been completely restored. And yet, what intrigued me most was the light in his eyes, an inner glow, subtle but impossible to ignore. Some doctors would say the brain creates illusions when deprived of oxygen, that the tunnel of light, the voices, and the presences are neurochemical phenomena. But what Eduardo conveyed went beyond any scientific explanation. He didn't describe what he saw, he described what he felt, and no feeling is the product of an electrical failure. In one of our last conversations before his discharge, he told me something that still echoes in me to this day. Doctor, I understood something there. We never really die, we just change sides. And sometimes, when love still calls us, we come back. At that moment, I wasn't a doctor. I was simply human. And for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like answering, only listening. In the days following that conversation, I found myself thinking about Eduardo more often than I expected. Even after other shifts, other cases, other emergencies, it was as if something in that story kept pulsing inside me, calling me back to that night. Medicine had trained me to understand causes and effects, but what happened to him escaped every logic I knew. When I returned to his room on the 6th day, I found him sitting up, no longer on oxygen, gazing out. The window. Outside, the sun hid behind clouds, and a golden reflection spread across the floor. He turned to me and said, "It's strange, Doctor. Since I came back, everything seems to have more color. The sound, the wind, even silence is different. It's like I'd been asleep for years and finally woke up." I sat beside him. "Do you remember everything that happened?" He nodded slightly, but his eyes were distant, as if words were too small for what he wanted to say. "I remember leaving my body. It was like the weight disappeared, and suddenly I was above, seeing you trying to bring me back. I saw you, the nurse, the stopped clock, and Anna on her knees." He paused. "I tried to talk to her. I wanted to say it was okay, but she couldn't hear me. And then I felt someone holding me. Not a hand, but a presence. A force that told me not to be afraid." "And were you?" He thought for a moment. "No. The fear stayed here, in the body. Where I was, there was only calm and light. A light that didn't hurt my eyes. It was alive, warm, and felt intelligent. It showed me things, but not with images. It was like I just knew what was being shown, without needing to see." I stayed silent. There was no way to confirm or deny. All I could do was listen. He went on. "I saw my life, not like a movie, but as feelings. Every moment I made someone smile, every time I hurt someone, it all came back. It was fast, but I could feel everything. The light didn't judge me. It just showed me, like it was saying, 'Look at what you created.'" His words gave me chills. And then it was like I was in a place with no ground, but without fear, and I heard a voice. It wasn't male or female. It just said, "It's not time yet." And then I felt a huge force pulling me, and I woke up. His hands trembled slightly. Anna, listening silently, cried. But what struck me most wasn't her tears. It was Eduardo's gaze. There was no euphoria, no confusion, only a serenity I'd rarely seen in anyone. He seemed reconciled with something, as if he had received an answer he'd been searching for his entire life. Later, when the team gathered to discuss the case, one of my colleagues asked, "Do you really believe in these near-death stories, Doctor?" And for the first time, I didn't know how to answer. For years, I'd relied on numbers, studies, evidence. But in front of Eduardo, all of that felt insufficient. It was impossible to look at that man and not feel that something had happened, something real, even if intangible, The day before his discharge, he asked to speak to me alone. When I entered the room, he smiled and said, "Doctor, do you know what struck me the most?" I shook my head. "When I saw you trying to revive me, I saw you hesitate for a second before continuing. In that moment, I felt you heard the same thing I did. It's not over yet." I froze. I didn't remember saying anything, but it was true. For a moment during the resuscitation, a voice inside me had told me to keep going, even when the protocol said to stop. And now, hearing that from a man who was technically dead at that exact moment, made me question whether, somehow, we had shared something that transcends the physical world. Eduardo was discharged a week later. He walked out smiling, full of vitality that defied every medical expectation. Before leaving, he turned and said, "Don't try to understand, doctor. Just feel. Sometimes reason only gets in the way." I stood there watching him walk down the hallway with Anna, and I realized that something inside me had also changed. Not just how I saw my patients, but how I saw life itself. Maybe, I thought, death isn't the opposite of existence. Maybe it's just a pause of silence before the soul decides to continue the song. For years, I believed medicine was the border between man and the unknown, that we doctors were the guardians of that frontier, tasked with decoding the body, mastering biology, and defying destiny. But after that night, I realized the frontier doesn't exist. There's only a point where human knowledge goes silent and something greater begins to speak. The days following Eduardo's discharge were strange. I returned to the hospital, saw other patients, read new test results, but nothing felt the same. It was as if, after watching someone cross the boundary of death and return, the rest of life had gained a new texture, more fragile and yet more precious. I replayed every instant of that night in my mind. The sound of the monitors, the sweat under my mask, the pressure of the chest compressions, the feeling of life slipping through my fingers, and then, suddenly, coming back. I couldn't forget it, but what haunted me wasn't the event itself. It was the question it left behind. Why? Why did he come back? Why, at that exact moment, after exceeding the safe limit without a pulse, did he wake up as if nothing had happened? Why, among so many who lose the fight, did life choose to give him a second chance? For weeks, I searched for answers. I read studies on near-death experiences, neurological reports, theories about residual synapses, hypoxic hallucinations, the brain's self-defense mechanisms. But the more I read, the further I drifted from the truth, because truth, that word we value so much in medicine, might not be something we explain. Maybe it's something we feel. One night, leaving the hospital, I stopped in the empty parking lot. It was drizzling, and the reflection of the lights on the asphalt reminded me of the glow Eduardo had described, that warm, living light. And for a moment, I closed my eyes. I thought about how many times I had seen life begin, and how many times I had seen it leave. How many patients I'd lost before my eyes, and how many had come back, defying everything I believed was possible. And I realized that maybe we're all just channels, instruments of something that acts through us, not by us. Medicine had always taught me to fight death, but after Eduardo, I began to see death differently. Not as an enemy, but as a sacred boundary, a passage that doesn't always close on the other side. Maybe it doesn't come to take, but to remind us that we control nothing, that every heartbeat is a gift, and that existence itself is a miracle disguised as routine. I spoke to Anna again a few weeks later. She told me Eduardo had completely changed, that he woke up every day grateful, that nothing upset him anymore, that he saw purpose in every small gesture. And she said something that touched me deeply. "He didn't come back the same, doctor, and somehow neither did you." She was right. I wasn't the same. That experience pulled me out of the comfort zone of science and threw me into a space of silence, the space where faith is born, but not blind or religious faith. It was a quiet faith, made of respect for what I don't understand. A faith that doesn't deny reason, but complements it. Over time, I realized medicine and spirituality aren't opposites. They are two languages trying to describe the same mystery, life, and each touches a different part of the truth. Science understands how, faith understands why, and when the two meet, something profound happens, something that transforms not only the body, but also the heart of whoever witnesses it. Today, when I walk through the ICU halls, I still feel that chill whenever a patient's monitor beeps. But along with the fear comes another feeling, the reminder that sometimes the unexplainable isn't a failure of science, it's simply the moment when it must step back and let the mystery act. And maybe that's the real miracle, to keep believing even when everything seems lost, to keep trying even when the protocol says to stop. Because in the end, it's right there, at the exact point where science bows before the unknown, that humanity reveals itself in its purest form. Months have passed since that night, but even now, every detail of that case lives inside me. The sound of the monitor beeping again, the body that responded when no one believed it would, the calm eyes of someone who returned from where no one returns. Eduardo became a living reminder of the thin line between the possible and the eternal. Every now and then, he sends me messages. He says he changed his life, left the road, started working near home with his family. He says time now has a new meaning, that he no longer measures days by the clock, but by the moments that make him feel alive. And every time I read his words, I remember that night when that same watch, frozen at 1:27, started ticking again the exact second his heart began to beat once more. There are coincidences that can't be explained, only accepted. Sometimes I wonder if what I witnessed was truly a miracle, but the more I think about it, the less I care about the name we give it. Because maybe the miracle isn't in the event itself, but in the transformation it leaves behind. The real miracle is what happens afterward, when something awakens inside us and never goes back to sleep. Before Eduardo, I saw the hospital as a battlefield. Each saved life was a victory, each loss a defeat. Now I see it differently. I understand that life isn't a war, it's a continuous breath, something that flows through us, passes by us, and continues on. And the doctor's role, I now see, isn't to defeat death, but to accompany life with respect until the very last second, to help the body fight, yes, but also to accept with humility when it's the soul that decides the outcome. I still remember what he told me before leaving the hospital. "Doctor, you brought me back, but it wasn't just you. I heard when you wanted to stop, and I heard when you decided to continue. That's when everything changed." Those words have stayed with me ever since, because they remind me that often the difference between giving up and saving someone isn't in technique. It's in that instant when we believe, for no logical reason, that there's still a chance. And it's not about blind faith. It's a kind of faith born from the very act of caring. When we place our hands on a chest that no longer beats, there's something invisible there. A bond connecting the one who tries to save and the one who wants to be saved. And for a moment, doctor and patient become one single body fighting against oblivion. Maybe that's what we call compassion, and maybe that is the real miracle. Today, when I enter an ICU, I don't just see numbers and graphs. I see stories. I see promises, loves, fears, and silent forces that keep people tethered to life. I've learned that a hospital isn't just a place of pain, it's also a temple of hope. There, among the machines and the noise, happen the deepest encounters between the human and the divine. When night falls and silence takes over the corridors, sometimes I close my eyes and hear the distant echo of a steady beep, a simple, repetitive sound, but one that carries the weight of existence. And I think, how many times a day does the impossible happen right in front of us, and we call it coincidence? How many times does life give us proof that there's something beyond, and we simply don't notice? I don't know what exists after death, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt, And I know that that night something showed me the line between body and spirit is thinner than I ever imagined. Since then, I've never touched a patient without remembering that beneath the skin, there's more than blood and bone. There's a light that insists, a will that returns, a presence that sometimes chooses to remain. And if there's one thing I've learned as a doctor and as a man, it's that life always finds a way to continue, even when everything seems to have stopped.